Hello everybody, Ben Woodruff here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the so-called Tree of Life at Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. I'm going to be talking about some recent information that has come to life based off of some archaeological studies. So, before we jump into this, we need to know what is Chaco Canyon at all. And that is, we could do volumes just on that. So just a quick overview. In New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloan people are generally considered to have been having a certain way of life from about 300 BC to about 1600 AD. So big old chunk of time. These are people who lived in above ground pueblos as well as cliff dwellings of all different kinds. Mesa Verde is probably the most famous set of cliff dwellings that people are typically aware of. So these people lived a very long time. In a much smaller chunk of time, in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, from about 900 AD to about 1150 AD, you have the Chaco explosion. So people have been living in Chaco Canyon since the Ice Age. People have come through, hunter-gatherers, basket makers, all different kinds. But during that 980 to about 1150 to 1280 is what, so for about 250, 300 years, Chaco exploded. And as a result, they built incredible structures, 4 or 5 story tall Pueblo great houses. So in Chaco Canyon, there's a lot of small pueblos, typically on the south side of the river. And these have, they're just like 8 rooms in a kiva, 12 rooms in a kiva. They're pretty small. They're pretty little. On the north side of the river, you have these Chaco and great houses, and many of these will have hundreds of rooms, and they're just incredible. They're massive. And Chaco, we don't know everything about it, but we know they had a great pull. They had great power and political pull throughout the whole region. We know they had trade goods that they brought in from Mexico. So, for example, we know that they brought in copper bells. We know that they brought in cacao beans from Puerto Vallarta region, which is cacao to make chocolate. It's pretty impressive. We know they brought in live macaws. We found hundreds of macaws throughout the region that were kept. It's pretty incredible thinking of that kind of a trade route. So this is a powerful community. But one thing they didn't have was a lot of wood. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of beams that were brought in from about 50 to 60 miles away from a couple different mountain ranges on foot. Now, these were built for the structures, for the rooftops. So you make an adobe structure, and then you're going to make your beams going across, and then you can lay mats or whatever on top, and you have floors. But that's a long way to go. They had no draft animals, and so you're hauling everything on foot, which is incredible, thinking of people hauling wood on foot that far away. I mean, just traveling on foot 50 miles through severe desert regions is incredible. But they did it. And we also were lucky. It's kind of the birthplace of dendrochronology in the archaeological record, which is where we're studying tree rings. So if you have a tree, every year a tree grows in certain patterns. It'll grow a ring, and next year it grows a ring, and it's based off of precipitation in certain patterns. And so and that tells a story of that tree. And they'll overlap. So if you have a tree that lived these years, and this tree lived these years, then some of those tree rings are going to overlap, which is pretty cool because we can find all over the world, we can overlap, and find out when things lived and how old they go back very accurately. And we calibrate it with trees that go back as far as 5,000 years old, which are the bristlecone pines. Now, in addition to the living bristlecone pines that are, got a 5,000-year-old tree, you can do tree rings on it. Well, there's also trees that died 8, 9, 10,000 years ago at these high elevations, and they still are intact, and we can still do tree rings on those dead trees that are still at high elevations. For example, in Utah and Nevada and Colorado, bristlecone pines give us this opportunity. And because we know that for sure, I don't know if you're aware of this, but carbon dating is calibrated with bristlecone pine material. So they calibrate it. You get it close, but then you calibrate it with bristlecone pine material. So dendrochronology, bristlecone pines help, But again, all the thousands of core samples have been taken from the beams at Chaco Canyon. And so we have a very good idea of what was going on climatically, but we also chemically can study these beams and understand where they came from. So we can study, because trees are absorbing from the soil certain chemicals, certain nutrients, and certain minerals, and they leave those isotopes in the wood itself. So from that, you can find out what region a tree came from. And that is how we know where some of these trees came from. We know they were sourced for so long. So if you ever go to Chaco Canyon itself it's pretty desolate. It's really quite harsh. There's some cottonwood trees growing down by the rivers, but other than that, there's nothing. There's not even juniper trees. Now, it's entirely possible that people who lived there anciently would have cut down any trees that were in the area. But by and large, what we were told and what we find out is that even in ancient times, it was wetter, but even in ancient times, there weren't many trees at all in the area. And so to build these great structures, trees were hauled in from elsewhere. So it's important to remember with what we're talking about. So Chaco Canyon had all these great houses, these big great house communities where one great house, would have 500 rooms, 700 rooms. So, but you're looking at a basically desolate landscape, just mostly kind of tan landscape, and of course corn was cultivated, so you would have had that green. But you basically are looking at a tan, fairly bleak, fairly stark landscape with no trees. Well, at an excavation in the early 1900s, a giant tree was found in Pueblo Bonito. Now, Pueblo Bonito is the most famous of the Chaco and Great Houses, and it's the most well excavated and restored that you can walk through it and stuff. So they had these great plazas, and apparently there was this big giant tree, and it's been called the Tree of Life by a lot of people. They've coined that phrase. This was the Tree of Life. Now, there's something called the Chaco Meridian. We know out of Pueblo Bonito, Chaco has many roads that go for miles and miles and miles and go to different outlier communities, 20 miles away, 50 miles away, 70 miles away, and they're all based off of this meridian, this line coming out of Chaco, specifically Pueblo Bonito. And so it has been proposed that in this stark landscape, there was this one ponderosa pine growing, and it was like, hey, let's leave this here. This is kind of represents the center of life, the tree of life, and all roads come out from this one sacred tree. It's a beautiful idea. It's a beautiful icon. And when you see these reconstructions, then you see people draw or paint what Pueblo Bonito used to look like. Then it's kind of, I love the aesthetic of, again, this stark, beautiful, the red adobe and the tan landscape, and then this enormous vertical tree, standing up there in the middle of nowhere. It's beautiful. It's beautiful, and you can see why people would come around it, why it would be iconic for the area. People growing up in that landscape would never have seen a ponderosa like that, and so it would just be magical. It would be amazing. Love the idea, but it turns out it's not true at all in any way, shape, or form. So the archaeologists who excavated and pulled up this particular piece, they jumped to the conclusion that it was a living tree that had been alive right there. But it turns out that's not the case. So based on the combined analysis and all the available evidence, scientists have actually concluded that the plaza tree of Pueblo Bonito did not grow there. It didn't grow at Pueblo Bonito at all. Instead, it seems to have been hauled in from the Chushka mountain range 50 miles away, 50 miles west of Chaco Canyon. Now, it's probably along of the many other the ponderosa pines that were brought in to make beams used for construction, probably came along with those. But this particular tree was enormous. Now, based off of an analysis of the remains of this tree, the tree itself lived in the Chushka Mountains for more than 250 years. The scientists don't know exactly when the tree died because the outer bark on the tree rings have rotted away. There would have been enough moisture that it rotted away, so we don't know, actually the birth of that tree. But from the tree rings, we know that the tree was living until the early 1100s. Following its death, by either natural causes or by people cutting it down, it was transported to Pueblo Bonito in the 12th century. It was transported to Pueblo Bonito in the 12th century, and there it was either abandoned or employed for some other purpose. We don't know what happened, but it was there and it was hauled on foot. It was over 20 feet long. It was enormous, this huge tree, and it was hauled on foot 50 miles. Now, it could have been that it was propped up for some ceremonial purpose. We don't know. It could have been left up on its own and it toppled, but whatever happened, eventually it collapsed into the plaza after the Chacoan occupation, and finally it was buried by windblown sand over the centuries. But it was basically just there. It's just basically fallen in the plaza, and a little bit of dust and dirt had built up over it. So when it was uncovered, it's amazing. This like over 1,000-year-old tree that's still intact. We don't know what it was used for. We know where it came from. We know it came from the Chushka Mountains. That's over 50 miles away. And so again, we know that the Chacoans were hauling wood on foot. And again, it stands to reason, if you've got wood over there, why not live over there? But for whatever reason, Chaco was so important or so established that people were bringing goods in from miles around to Chaco. It has been proposed that this one post, since it wasn't a live tree, it was a dead tree, turns out that this one post could have been something to use to, kind of like with Stonehenge, where, hey, it's going to leave a mark. We know it elsewhere in the canyon. For example, up on Fabada Butte in Chaco, there's what's called the sun dagger stones. There's some rocks that are kind of positioned in a certain way, and they let little cracks of light in, and at a certain day, at a certain time, on the solstices and the equinoxes, the light from the sun will cast a little light right in the middle of a spiral, so you can keep track of these important dates, which are very important for things like planting and harvest. So people have said, well, maybe that's what this giant post was for. Maybe it was up there, and we could then, have it on a certain day. It's going to point at a certain point in that plaza. We also know that there are modern descendants of Puebloan peoples who do have a big old ceremonial post still in their Pueblo, and they'll have certain things on it at certain times of the year for certain ceremonies. So that is a tradition that is alive today and could have had its origins at Chaco. We're not entirely sure. But whatever it was, we know that this thing was treated with respect. How do we know that? Because it has no drag marks. So again, if you're hauling, this tree this big from 50 miles away on foot, no wagons, no draft animals, you'd think they might drag it, but they didn't. On the bark itself, there are no drag marks. There is no kind of frictive sort of damage to the wood itself. So this post itself was treated with respect. We don't always see that with the smaller posts that are brought in. We see that sometimes on one end they were drug in, like you're carrying the front, dragging the back. But this thing was hauled. How many people would have taken to haul this big old giant 20-foot piece of tree? We don't know. But it clearly mattered to them. So, so to conclude, we don't know what it is, but we do know what it isn't. And what it wasn't was a living tree in the plaza. And that is the primary reason for making this video. I wanted to make you a little bit more aware of Chaco Canyon, and I'll have other videos coming out that will go into greater depth on that. But the main thing is I want you to understand these beautiful depictions of this beautiful living tree, the tree of life, are actually entirely inaccurate. And we know for a fact that in truth, this tree was either dead or cut in the Chushka Mountains, 50 miles west, and it was hauled in on foot by a number of people, where it was erected and held a prominent spot for probably several hundred years, and then eventually it fell down probably of its own accord and was buried by sand where it was found today. So pretty fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the Tree of Life. I would love to hear in the comments your views, your thoughts on what you think this thing might have been for. But again, just remember that it was not alive in the Pueblo Bonito Plaza itself. It was already dead when it was hauled and erected there. So setting the record straight, in science we're always learning. We make our best hypotheses off the information we have, and then when we get more information, we reevaluate and readapt our understanding of history and prehistory. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more, and please always remember that life is a gift. So never stop learning and never stop exploring. We'll see you next time.